Now we will begin. Intercountry Adoption is the status quo acceptable forum hosted by the Presidential Committee on Aging Society and Population Policy and co-organized by Good Neighbors, Save the Children, and Child Fund Korea. Hello everyone, I am Director Myung-suk Chae from the Presidential Committee and I will be the MC for today's event. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to everyone for your participation despite your busy schedules. So to briefly explain about today's schedule, starting from the welcome remarks, we will listen to our panelists' opinions on intercountry adoption and finish with a Q&A session. Now then, we will invite Head of Secretariat Jin-kyung Park of the Presidential Committee for the welcome remarks. Greetings everyone, I am Jin-kyung Park, Head of Secretariat of Presidential Committee on Aging Society and Population Policy. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to journalist Hong Ki-John, Director Sunny Engelsoft, Dr. Nigel Cantwell for joining online from the US, Denmark, and Geneva. In addition, we have many joining from overseas via Zoom. So despite the pandemic, we are very fortunate to have the non-face-to-face technologies that are bringing the world closer. In particular, I believe it is a very good time to establish an international bond regarding intercountry adoption, an issue that many countries are entangled in. So I believe it is very fortunate. Former president of Mission to Promote Adoption in Korea, Kwan-hoon Lee, is joining offline. Dr. Chae-min Kim and Professor Ik-chung Chung, who will serve as the moderator of today's event. Thank you very much. In addition, I would like to extend my gratitude to National Assemblyman Sung-ju Kim, who introduced legislation on intercountry adoption and sent us the video congratulatory remarks. We have many other participants joining this forum via YouTube, and I am very grateful that so many are paying so much interest to this important topic. Today's forum was possible thanks to the active participation and efforts of child-focused adoption policy TF experts of the Presidential Committee. And we also have 3 experts who are participating through Zoom, and we have other professors and many officials who also put a lot of efforts to make today's forum possible. So because of the complicated domestic issues surrounding adoption, it was not an easy task to bring the topic intercountry adoption out for public debate. And I feel very grateful that all of you accompanied us in this difficult journey. I would like to extend my deep gratitude to Good Neighbors, Save the Children, and Child Fund Korea for joining us in our efforts to protect the rights of children. All children are born with the universal right to receive protection from parents in a family and grow healthily. Setting this as the top priority and creating the right environment for it must be the role of governments. After fulfilling this role, domestic adoption must take place as the last resort for the best interests and rights of children. However, in the long history of intercountry adoption, serving the best interests of the children and even access to the top policy priorities are not being done properly. This reality made Korea an unprecedented country in the world that sent children abroad for nearly 70 years. In addition, although we signed the Hague Convention, we are not being ratified because we failed to prepare the implementation legislation for the implementation of the convention, such as revising the Special Adoption Act. In addition, children being sent abroad are not orphans as in the past, but are mostly children of single mothers. The harsh reality in Korea, such as the normal family ideology, prejudice, and discrimination against children born out of wedlock are forcing us to ignore the best interests of children and pushing them away from Korea. Therefore, Presidential Committee on Aging Society and Population Policy decided to strengthen the public responsibility of the country and the local governments to protect the best interests of children in the entire adoption process, including the determination of adoption in the fourth Plan for Aging Society and Population Plan. We are planning to actively perform specific and concrete assignments in order to establish an inter-country and domestic adoption system led by the government, including the revision of the Special Adoption Act. Moreover, we are planning to explore ways to establish an adoption system that prioritizes the birth family. This morning, I'm sure a lot of you must have seen this, a reporter said Korea beat India and China, becoming the third largest sending country of adoptees, and criticized that many governments kept avoiding dealing with inter-country adoption issues. The reporter also said low fertility forced Korea to re-examine inter-country adoption and even criticized the presidential committee. For decades, we finally brought the long-avoided issue into question in the context of low fertility, such an approach could be offensive to 170,000 Korean adoptees and treats children as mere statistics or tools. So we take this criticism very seriously. I hope today's forum provides us with an opportunity to think about the existence of 170,000 international adoptees who wish to discover their roots and the stigma attached to Korea as the leading exporter of children, and hope to see various efforts and bonds being formed that transcends the inertial approach and perception for children-focused adoption policy. I would like to thank everyone joining from Korea and abroad once more, and Happy New Year, and thank you.
Next. Thank you. Next, National Assemblyman Sang-Joo Kim, who proposed inter-country adoption legislation, will give us video congratulatory remarks. Good afternoon. I am Sang-Joo Kim, Executive Secretary of the National Assembly Health and Welfare Committee. Is the status quo of inter-country adoption acceptable? I sincerely welcome the hosting of today's forum. Inter-country adoption began in Korea in the 60s, and it still continues even after Korea became an advanced economy. Due to COVID-19 virus pandemic, international movements were limited. But even in 2020, 47% of all adopted children from Korea were sent abroad. Inter-country adoption exposes the welfare gap and the abandoned duty of the Korean government. When inter-country adoption first started in the 60s, most adopted children were orphans or mixed-race children. From the 1980s till today, mostly poor children, children of single mothers, and children with disabilities are adopted abroad. Social and economic conditions make it difficult for birth parents to raise their own children. Children separated from their families are not protected by the government, but are sent away to foreign countries. I am ashamed of our society that allows this. Adoption has a profound impact on children. Therefore, the entire process of adoption should be centered around children who will be most affected by it. So adoption decisions, especially for inter-country adoption, should be made very carefully. I recognize this problem, and last year, to increase the government's responsibility through the entire adoption process, I proposed the whole amendment of the Special Adoption Act. And to protect adopted children coming in and out, I proposed legislation on inter-country adoption. Today's forum will be joined by experts who have investigated and studied for a long time inter-country adoption as well as an adoptee and an adoptive parent. They will share their views on intercountry adoption. I look forward to hearing their concerns, thoughts, and insights. I pay close attention to today's discussion and design policies to best protect children's rights. Thank you. Thank you, National Assemblyman Kim. Now the forum will begin. I kindly ask, and today's Ik Jung-chong, Director of the Presidential Committee of Child Focused Adoption Policy TF and Professor at Ihwa, will be moderating today's event. Now I will hand the microphone over to Ik Jung-chong. Good afternoon. I am Chong Ik-jung. And as Secretary had mentioned, even before the coronavirus broke, Korea became the third largest sending country. Other countries have reduced intercountry adoption, but even during corona pandemic, intercountry adoption increased. This shows that the reality of Korea, and this gives us a reason to look back on our policies. And we have to. There should be many people who want to talk about the negative aspects of intercountry adoption. In our history, for a long time, there have been many positive aspects highlighted in our history about intercountry adoption. And I believe that this was the process of democratization, and I am and the presidential committee is hosting this event. And many people might think of it as a way to deal with low fertility, but that's a mistake. And we are using this opportunity to really overcome and address adoption issues. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us for today's event. And now I would like to begin by introducing each panelist. And many participants are joining us from abroad. And we also have presenters from abroad. First of all, the co-author of the book Baby Selling Country, journalist Hong Ki-jeon, is joining us from the US through Zoom. Please say hello to us. Thank you. I am Jeon Hong-ki, journalist for Prescient. A Korean adopted to Denmark and director of the documentary film Forget Me Not, Sunny Engelstov is joining us from Denmark through Zoom. 안녕하세요. Thank you. And we also have an adopted President MPEC Hwan-hoon Lee is with us. Hello, my name is Hwan-hoon. An international consultant on child protection, Nigel Cantwell is joining us from Geneva. Dr. Cantwell?
Yes, hello, good afternoon, good morning from here. Looking forward very much to this discussion and debate. Hope to learn a lot about the Korean situation in particular, and hope to be able to exchange on some of the global aspects of the issue that we're talking about. Thanks very much.
네, 감사합니다. 마지막으로 과거 해외 입양 절차 인권 침해 실태 조사를 하신 성공회대 사회과학연구소 김재민 박사님 참석하셨습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 성공회대 사회과학연구소 김재민입니다. 반갑습니다.
네, 이제 본격적으로 포럼을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 해외 입양에 대한 토론자분들의 의견을 듣도록 하겠는데요. 발표 시간은 10분. 제가
Okay, so now we will begin the forum. First, we will listen to the opinions of our panelists, and the presentation will each be 10 minutes. So as for those joining from overseas, we collected the video presentations. So we will first look at the video presentations and then collect through Zoom. Okay, so the first will be the video presentation.
안녕하세요. 발제를 맡은 프레시안 전원기의 기자입니다. 먼저 제가 이 이슈를 처음 취재하게 된 계기와 그동안 보고 겪었던 일들에 대해 좀 말씀을 드리면서 제 문제의식을 분명히 하고 싶습니다. 저는 이 문제를 처음 취재하게 된 건 2007년인데요. 당시 저희 회사 사무실이 해외 입양인들을 위한 기관인 뿌리의 집 근처에 있어서 뿌리의 집에 계신 분들이 저를 찾아와서 국제 입양 이슈에 대해서 말씀을 해주셨고, 제가 그 문제의식에 깊이 공감해서 처음으로 기획 기사를 쓰면서 이 주제에 대해 관심을 갖게 됐습니다. 그래서 이분들과 계속 인연을 이어가다가 2017년 5월 추방 입양인 필립 클레이시가 자살하게 됐다는 충격적인 소식을 듣게 됐는데요. 그래서 그 이후로 6개월 동안 국제 입양 문제를 심층 취재해서 보도했고, 이 결과물은 한 권의 책으로 묶여 나오기도 했습니다. 첫 번째 사진이 필립 클레이시의 유골함입니다. 이 유골함은 그해 6월 양부모에게 인도됐습니다. 그리고 나서 저는 2019년 미국 워싱턴 특파원으로 발령을 받았는데요. 사실 워싱턴에 오게 되면서 취재 분야가 좀 달라져서 사실 이 이슈에 대해서는 한 발 멀어질 거라고 생각했는데, 사실 제가 기자로서의 저에게 좋은 숙제가 아닐까 싶을 정도로 이 이슈가 사실 미국 정치권 내에서도 다뤄지고 있었습니다. 그중 하나가 입양인 시민권법 이슈인데요. 성인이 됐지만 시민권을 취득하지 못한 입양인들을 구제하는 목적의 법안입니다. 이 입양인 시민권법은 2009년부터 여러 차례 발의가 됐지만 2년이라는 짧은 회기 기간 동안에 제대로 다루지 못하고 번번이 폐기되는데요. 그래서 2019년도에도 발의됐지만 폐기됐고, 2021년도에도 다시 네 번째 발의된 상황이지만 통과 여부는 불투명한 상황입니다. 제가 이 이슈를 미국에서 취재하면서 만나게 된 분들 중에 가장 인상적인 분이 미국 해군으로 10년이나 복무했지만 시민권을 취득하지 못한 리아 리시였는데요. 사실 이 분의 이야기를 들으면서 성인이 되기 전에 시민권 취득 기회를 놓친 입양인들이 개인의 노력으로 시민권을 취득하는 일이 얼마나 어려운 일인지 깨닫게 됐습니다. 그리고 이 문제가 평생 이분들에게 얼마나 고통을 주고 있는지에 대해서도 다시 한번 알게 됐고요. 이렇게 제가 15년 동안 국제 입양 이슈에 대해서 지속적인 관심을 갖고 취재해오는 동안, 물론 한국 사회에도 입양을 바라보는 인식에 크고 작은 변화가 있었습니다. 입양인 당사자들의 노력으로 2012년도에 입양특례법이 전면 개정됐고, 미혼모와 그 자녀들에 대한 편견도 일부 해소됐습니다. 그렇지만 한국은 여전히 국제 입양을 규율하는 가장 중요한 국제 협약인 헤이그 국제 입양 협약에 아직도 가입하지 못하고 있습니다. 그리고 입양 결정과 그 과정을 사실상 민간 입양기관에게 맡기면서 발생하는 문제들에 대한 법 제도적 개선도 큰 진전을 보지 못하고 있는 상황입니다. 이런 가운데 지난해 많은 한국인들이 정말 분노했던 정인이 사건에서도 드러난 것처럼 허술한 입양 법제와 사후관리 시스템으로 인한 피해는 국제 입양뿐만 아니라 국내 입양된 아동들에게도 예외가 아니라는 사실이 드러났습니다. 저는 사실 입양 당사자가 아닙니다. 입양인이거나 입양 부모가 아니기 때문에 삶의 기나긴 과정에서 입양 이슈에 대해서는 이야기하는 것은 제 범위 밖이라고 생각을 하고요. 저는 기자로서 주로 법과 제도의 문제, 그리고 그것이 입양인들의 인권에 얼마만큼 침해하고 있는지 부분에 대해서 주로 초점을 맞춰서 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다. 일단 우리나라 국제 입양과 관련된 법과 제도의 문제점의 연원을 따져가 보면 저는 첫 단추부터 잘못 끼워졌다고 생각합니다. 한국에서 국제 입양이 시작된 것은 1953년 한국전쟁 직후 이승만 정권 때입니다. 전쟁으로 인한 고아들을 구제한다는 명분이었는데요. 사실 그 이면에는 미군을 포함한 외국 군인들과 한국 여성 사이에 태어난 혼혈 아동을 국외로 내보내려는 목적도 있었습니다. 이승만 정권은 일국 일민주의를 정치적 신조로 내세웠고, 그래서 이 기간 동안 혼혈 아동 4명 중 3명이 입양을 통해서 국외로 내보내졌습니다. 그리고 이들 중 다수가 고아가 아니라 어머니가 기르거나 친척이 기르던 아동들이었습니다. 사실상 아버지의 나라로 보낸다는 명분을 내세워 사실상 가족끼리 생이별을 한 것이었습니다. 첫 번째 사진이 1950년대 전세기를 태워서 국제 입양을 보내는 모습인데요. 한 3,000명 정도의 아동이 전세기 수송을 통해서 이렇게 입양이 보내졌습니다. 이런 집단 수송 과정에는 사망, 전염병 감염 등 안타까운 사고들도 많이 일어났습니다. 그리고 한국이 고아 수출국이라는 오명을 듣게 된 시기는 전두환 정권 때입니다. 전두환 정권은 국제 입양을 이민 확대 및 민간 외교라는 명분을 내세워 정말 크게 늘렸습니다. 특히 1980년대 중후반에는 한 해 출생 아동의 1%에 해당하는 아동이 해외로 입양됐습니다. 이는 아동 밀매, 납치 등 정말 큰 국제적 스캔들이 됐던 과테말라의 국제 입양 사례를 제외하고는 다른 나라에서는 보기 힘든, 찾아볼 수 없는 사례입니다. 그래서 1988년 서울 올림픽을 전후로 해서 한국이 국제적으로 조금 주목을 받게 되자 국제 입양 문제는 외신들에서 심층 보도되기 시작했습니다. 그래서 이 과정에서 아기 매매, 아동 매매, 고아 수출국 등의 용어가 만들어졌고 이것이 한국에 굉장히 불명예스러운 꼬리표가 됐죠. 이처럼 입양은 사실 정치, 경제, 사회적 이유로 국제 입양이 계속 추진됐다고 보여집니다. 그리고 국제 입양은 이 아동들을 국외로 내보내면서 한국 사회의 기존 질서를 유지하는 데도 굉장히 중요한 역할을 했습니다. 무슨 말이냐면 한국은 굉장히 보수적이고 가부장적인 가족 질서를 갖고 있는 사회인데요. 그것을 유지하는 데, 정상가족 이데올로기를 유지하는 데 굉장히 중요한 역할을 했습니다. 예를 들면 출생신고 제도는 우리나라는 보편적 출생신고 제도를 갖고 있지 못합니다. 출생신고가 전적으로 부모한테 의존하고 있는 제도고요. 그리고 혼인 내 출산만을 정상으로 인정하며 혼인 외 출산에 대한 차별이 분명히 존재합니다. 그래서 혼외 자녀의 경우 입양을 사실상 권장하고 있는 제도라고 해석해도 크게 무리는 아닙니다. 그래서 실제로 국제 입양 내지는 전체 입양 아동의 90% 이상이 미혼모의 자녀들입니다. 그래서 역사적으로 따져보면 한국에서 가장 취약한 어머니들의 자녀들이 입양의 대상이 됐습니다. 외국군 부대 주변의 유흥업소에서 일하는 여성들의 자녀들, 그리고 도시로 상경한 젊은 여공들, 그리고 가정폭력이나 학대를 피해서 도망쳐 나온 젊은 미혼모들, 이들이 입양 보낸 어머니의 다수를 이루고 있었습니다. 이처럼 국제 입양은 미혼모와 그 아동들의 문제를 비가시와 은폐, 때로는 아예 없는 문제로 만들어버리죠. 그 과정에서 사실 정부는 이들에 대한 사회복지 비용을 아낄 수 있습니다. 더군다나 국제 입양의 경우 입양 수수료를 통해서 외화까지 벌어들일 수 있는 수단이었죠. 이런 과정을 통해서 국제 입양이 이루어졌을 경우 많은 부분 입양인들의 인권이 문제가 되는 경우가 많이 발생합니다. 대표적인 게 시민권의 문제고요. 두 번째가 친생 가족을 찾는 문제입니다. 이런 문제가 발생하게 되는 가장 근본적인 원인은 대리 입양 제도입니다. 한국은 2013년 입양특례법이 전면 개정되고 이것이 시행되기 전까지 입양 아동들을 한국에서 입양 재판을 거치지 않고 보냈습니다. 그렇기 때문에 입양 부모가 굳이 한국에 오지 않더라도 아동을 인수할 수 있는 시스템을 갖추고 있었죠. 이런 대리 입양 제도는 이승만 정권과 해리 홀트 아동복지회를 세운 해리 홀트 씨의 합작품이라고 할 수 있는데요. 이게 그 당시에는 굉장히 시급하게 많은 아동을 내보낼 필요성 때문에 만들어졌을지라도 이것이 2013년까지 유지되었다는 점에 있어서는 굉장히 심각한 문제라고 하지 않을 수 없습니다. 많은 입양인들이 자신이 입양되는 과정을 설명하면서 양부모들이 자신들을 마치 애완동물을 고르듯이 혹은 상품을 고르듯이 사진만 보고 골랐다라는 것을 굉장히 가슴 아픈 일로 이야기하거든요. 이처럼 대리 입양은 그 자체로도 반인권적인 제도였지만 더 큰 문제는 입양인들의 시민권을 보장하지 못하는 제도였다는 점입니다. 이처럼 입양 재판 없이 미국으로 보내진 아동들은 IR4 비자를 받아서 입국을 하는데요. 이 경우에는 10년짜리 영주권만 받을 수 있습니다. 이 기간 안에 입양 부모가 미국에서 재판을 거쳐서 정식으로 입양을 완료해야지만 시민권이 주어지는데 많은 입양 부모들이 이를 완수하지 않아서 성인이 되었을 때 한 20에서 30% 정도는 시민권이 없는 사람들로 추정되고 있습니다. 이 숫자가 예전에는 2만여 명으로 알려졌었는데 2021년 10월 보건복지부가 국정감사를 앞두고 김성주 의원실에 보낸 자료에 따르면 최소 43,830명으로 추정된다고 밝혔습니다. 그리고 이 시민권 문제가 가장 극단적인 경우로 다다랐을 때가 추방 입양인데요. 시민권을 획득하지 못한 입양인들 중에 일부가 본국으로 추방됩니다. 사실 이 경우에 미국 입장에서는 본국으로 보내는 거지만 입양인들 입장에서는 타국으로 가는 것입니다. 아는 사람도 없고 언어도 통하지 않고. 그래서 가장 극단적인 인권 침해 사례라고 할 수 있고 추방 입양인들은 한국에 와서 매우 어렵게 살고 있습니다. 그래서 앞서 말씀드렸던 클레이 씨 같은 경우 자살을 했고요. 그리고 감옥에 간 케이스도 있고 정신병원에 수용된 케이스도 있습니다. 그리고 가장 잘 알려진 아담 크랩서 씨는 대한민국 정부와 입양기관을 상대로 손해배상 청구 소송을 제기하기도 했죠. 근데 현재 크랩서 씨는 생계 문제로 결국 한국이 아니라 멕시코에서 일하고 있다고 알려진 상태입니다. 그리고 이제 입양인들 입장에서 중요한 문제가 친생 가족 찾기인데요. 앞서 말씀드렸던 것처럼 국제 입양 과정에서 입양 서류는 상당 부분 진실을 담지 못하는 경우가 많습니다. 그래서 국제 입양을 보내기 위해서 고아 호적을 만드는데 이 과정에 출생과 관련된 다수의 정보가 조작되거나 누락되는 경우가 많아서 사실 국제 입양인들 중에 친부모 찾기 성공하는 비율은 1%로 극히 희박하다고 합니다. 실제로 상봉까지 성사되는 경우가요. 그래서 사실 한국은 출생의 진실의 기초에서 신분이 등록될 권리를 국가가 보장해야 하는데 그러기는커녕 제도적으로 이를 방해하는 시스템을 갖고 있었던 나라였습니다. 마지막으로 제가 말씀드리고 싶은 건 앞서 헤이그 입양회관에 우리나라가 아직도 가입하지 못하고 있다고 말씀드렸는데 이것을 포함해서 국내법적으로도 사실 입양 관련된 법과 제도 개선은 매우 어려운 일입니다. 그래서 제가 정말 이 문제를 15년 동안 취재하면서 갖게 되는 의문은 정말 한국에서 입양 관련 제도의 개선은 왜 이렇게 힘들고 더디고 더딘 것일까? 이런 문제의식을 갖게 됐습니다. 그리고 사실 조금 있으면 2년 뒤면 한국이 국제입양을 시작한 지 70년이 되는 해입니다. 사실 그 이전에 입양특례법, 김성주 의원께서 발의하신 입양특례법 개정안이나 아니면 헤이그 협약, 국제입양협약과 관련된 여러 가지 정책적인 차원의 진전이 있기를 바라면서 제 발제를 마치도록 하겠습니다.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Chun. So she spoke about the laws and regulations, the history of intercountry adoption in Korea. So because of the conservative and patriarchal social order in Korea, and in order to reduce the welfare costs, Korea chose intercountry adoption, and that could lead to violation of human rights. So she spoke about these. And so we gained an overview. And now we are going to invite two more panelists and continue our forum. So next will be Director of Child-Focused Adoption Policy TF, Ms. Sunny Lee Engelstoff. She will give us a video presentation. And then she also sent us a trailer for her documentary Forget Me Not. So we're going to look at those videos.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this forum. I feel the weight of knowing that I represent one out of hundreds of thousands of Koreans who is sent overseas through international adoption. I'm an independent film director, and I have spent most of my adult life trying to find my way back to Korea to look for profound answers to my origin and heritage. Today I want to share some insight into the journey I've gone through and also share some of my findings from making the documentary Forget Me Not, a letter to my mother. This is a highly personal film, but I seem to always find that anything related to adoption is extremely emotional, as it is about family. My official name is Sunhee Engelstoff. This name I have given myself. Before that I was Lisbeth Engelstoff, and before that I was Shin Sunhee with the number K82C150. I don't know when I'm born. I don't know who gave me my name. I don't know who my parents are and who I'm related to. I don't know the medical history of my family, and I don't know if I will ever reconnect with anyone from my family or know the true story of my origin. My different names and numbers illustrate the different identities I've gone through and all the things I don't know about myself. And wherever I turn, I can't get any answers. I will try and explain this. My Danish mother and father couldn't tell me about Korea, as their knowledge of it was minimal. They had never been to Korea. Throughout my school years, no one knew about my South Korean heritage, and information was scarce. But my job was also not to be Korean. My finest task was to become Danish, and I tried so hard, but there were simply things I couldn't change. When I came back to Korea for the first time when I was 20 years old, an older woman, a stranger in a supermarket, said to me that I had such a Korean face. And I started to cry. I had never felt this recognition of where I belonged. I was born in Busan in 1982, sent to Namkwang orphanage the day I was born, and adopted to Denmark through Holt International when I was 4 months old. I grew up as an only child with my 2 white parents in the countryside. Any other Korean I would encounter in Denmark for the first 15 years of my life would have been Koreans who were internationally adopted, living with a white Danish family. There are more than 8,000 Korean adoptees in Denmark, which is only a country of 5.5 million people. So long before Hyundai, Samsung, K-pop and Parasite, what South Korea was known for in Scandinavia was all the babies coming in, a transaction that has never stopped. I grew up with being told from my adopted parents that I was given away from my Korean mother as an act of love, that my biological mother wanted the best for me and so she had given me away. For the first 20 years of my life, I never questioned this. It wasn't until I went to South Korea several times in my 20s and also attended the first IKAA gathering in Seoul with the delegation from the Danish association Koreaklubben that I was exposed to different perspectives on international adoption and really truly understood that I, as an individual, would never have been able to accumulate this much information about international adoption and the consequences of it without the collective work of the global adoptee community. I remember experiencing Korean women demonstrating in the streets in 2004 that they had their children stolen from them by adoption agencies. And I learned by accident that South Korea had institutions for pregnant women because I was on a motherland tour that had arranged a small field trip which ended up as such a home run by Catholic nuns. At that home, I met an 8 months pregnant woman who came over to me and asked me directly, "Are you happy to be adopted?" I didn't know what to answer her. First of all, no one ever asked me that. Secondly, her underlying question was, is it okay for me to give up my baby for adoption? To give it away? I had no good answer for her, but it changed my perspective from the narrative I grew up with. I suddenly understood that my identity issues were questions that were connected to other people than myself. It was connected to the mothers and their circumstances. I had to look elsewhere and outside of the adoptee community to find answers about adoption. After graduating from the National Film School of Denmark, I knew that I wanted to know much more about the women in South Korea. And because I couldn't find my mother or any other family there, I saw this as an opportunity to learn about what she might have gone through. Little did I know what I was about to encounter. Forget-me-not follows 3 women who have to make the decision of whether to keep their baby or give it up for adoption. None of them succeeds in keeping their children, although all of them want to. The film exposes how 3 young women end up losing their baby in 3 different ways. I discovered that there were over 50 institutions for pregnant women at the time, many of them not married. Over half of them were at the time run by adoption agencies who were known to reject taking women into their shelters if they wanted to keep their children. Later, it became illegal for adoption agencies to run those shelters. The institutions were a place where the women could hide during their pregnancy. They would hide from their families, close environment, work, school, their boyfriends or partners. They would hide because they didn't find help anywhere, or they would be sent there by their family and told not to leave. Some of them came there voluntarily to get some peace and guidance of what to do. For some of the women it was a shelter, and for some it was a prison. Women of all ages and all layers of society came to stay at the shelter. In fact, it was such a diverse group that the only thing that they had in common was that they were women and they were pregnant or had already given birth. When I met Mrs. M, the director of the shelter, where the film is shot, she said she'd always wanted someone to expose the women's conditions. She had encountered other adoptees and she really understood how much we needed to reconnect with Korea, the culture, but also understand the women she encountered in her work. She also thought that the women would be able to ask me questions in return. So she invited me to stay and live at the shelter, and this is what I did. I lived there on and off for 2 years, although the footage was filmed over 5 years. I don't speak Korean, and most of the women didn't speak English. But somehow we did communicate. For me it was eye-opening to be living with other Koreans and their babies, be familiar with their customs, and being racially mirrored and accepted as one of them. All of these experiences and the things I saw with my own eyes made me question everything I had been told about adoption, especially the phrase that my mother had given me away as an act of love. I had learned that women give up their children from desperation and blackmail. The women I encountered wanted to keep their children. They just didn't get the help they needed. If some women stated that they didn't want to keep their child, it was because they were told that their future and everything they ever dreamed about would disappear, and their families would cut all ties with them. There is no doubt in my mind and heart that international adoption is a violation of human rights. It is both a violation towards mothers and fathers forced to relinquish their babies. It's a violation of human rights towards the babies that will have no way of knowing fundamental knowledge about themselves, their families, and their culture. It will affect my children not to know their Korean heritage. Time has changed. South Korea is rich and has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. So why not try and solve this issue by protecting and taking care of the babies born in this country, instead of sending them away? Then include them in society and let them be part of the Republic of Korea, as they were meant to be. Support vulnerable mothers and fathers who need support of keeping their babies by giving them options and social security. Give them possibilities to advance in society so they can provide for their children. Here is a 3-minute trailer for Forget Me Not, a letter to my mother. I hope you will watch the whole film and share with your colleagues, friends, and families. Thank you for your time. 감사합니다.
Mor, hvordan træffer du det valg? Hvordan kan man give sit barn væk?
지금 이제 결정을 하게 되면 나중에 이게 나한테 어떤 이점이 있을까? 행복할 것 같아요. 여기를 잘 별일 없도록 잘 도와주십시오 이렇게 하는 거예요. 여기는 아기와 엄마들 건강하게 잘 도와주십시오.
집에서 반대하면 설득할 자신 있어? 힘들겠지?
근데 진짜 엄마 아빠만 허락하면 키우고 싶은데
모든 엄마들이 반드시 아기를 키워야 된다라는 생각을 하는 사람이에요. 아기를 키운다는 억지로 아버지 생각은 억지로 떼어놓겠다.
sit barn væk i kærlighed. Jeg prøver at forstå dig. Det gør jeg virkelig.
Thank you. So, Sunny Engelstoff, director, she has been adopted when she was only 4 months old. She was sent abroad. And so, the course of understanding how the mothers would think. So, she told us and explained us about her own experiences. And now we have this documentary which is released. So, I hope you have the chance to watch it. So, next, let's look at how the adoptive parents would actually think. So, former president of Mission to Promote Adoption in Korea, an adoptive parent and field expert, Mr. Kwan-hoon Lee. So, the former president, as well as the adoptive parent and field expert, Mr. Kwan-hoon Lee, will give us a video presentation on Intercountry presentation. And we also have him here as well. Please give him a big
Hello.
두 아들과 하나 딸 아이 한 명을 셋을 입양한 입양 부모이고요. 지금 이제 첫째 입양.
My first adopted son is now 21. I am so glad that they grew up so well. As an adopted parent, I wanted to make the world a happier place for them. And I worked with Mission to promote adoption in Korea for almost a decade. From my experience of raising adopted children at home and working on the field, I came to believe that intercountry adoption, I don't think it is acceptable as the status quo. But a lot of people talk about moratorium. However, it is hard for me to agree with it, at least for now. I believe that we have to create an environment that will encourage in domestic adoption. I think that's possible. I believe that the Korean government can do it. Until policies are improved, international adoption shouldn't be stopped. A moratorium without a good plan will only be detrimental to children. And the negative aspects mentioned earlier are closely linked to inadequate post-adoption management by the government and adoption agency. But what we pay more attention to is, even when domestic adoption is possible, due to flawed system and procedures, children are being easily sent abroad, and this should be closely investigated. According to the statistics, less than 3-year-old and healthy children, about 200 of them are sent abroad. Today's forum questions whether the status quo of inter-country adoption is acceptable. Under the overarching principle of child adoption policy, if we identify where inter-country adoption is, finding solutions will become easier. I believe that adoption policy should be designed under 4 major principles. First, the best interests of children should be prioritized. Second, children have the right to be raised in a family environment. Third, and child rearing rather than protection should be the priority. Fourth, the nation has the responsibility for child care. And there might be some conflicts. Then there might be the conflicts priorities. So we have to choose wisely. Considering these 4 principles, where is the best place for children to be raised? First, it would be best if children can be raised by birth families. So the government should try best to restore original families. And single mothers and fathers who are willing to keep their children should be able to receive enough financial support. And an enabling environment for child rearing should be created. I believe that that is the first and most priority. As far as I know, when children are placed in care homes, then about 30 million won is provided. I believe that that money is enough to provide support for single parents. Next, if children cannot be raised by their birth families, the government should send them, put them for adoption domestically. And earlier the better. I believe that they should be matched with the best possible parents, and that's the responsibility of the government and adoption agencies. And we also need to improve social perceptions and the child rearing environment, and support should be gradually increased. And Korea has a domestic adoption culture that prefers young baby girls, and that should be improved as well. If domestic adoption is not possible, children should be placed in professional foster care homes or small group homes. Such programs should be promoted so that they can grow up in a family environment, so that they can stay in Korea, and the conditions should be created to make that possible. If that's not possible in Korea, and if children cannot find families domestically, then if they can find good families, inter-country adoption could be okay. And there's conflicts of principles. However, but I believe that children should be raised in a family environment. I think that should be the priority. But the government should do its best to keep our children within the national boundaries. And care conditions should be created towards that direction. What I'm worried about is that and inter-country adoption shouldn't stop to address the low fertility rate. And low fertility is the failure of national policy, and that's adult-focused approach. And I don't believe that inter-country adoption should be stopped to make our statistics look good, and that's what I'm worried about. So, for children to grow up in domestic families, then we need to develop policies that will enable it and decrease or stop inter-country adoption. If we decrease or stop inter-country adoption, Koreans living abroad or married to foreign spouses should be allowed to adopt children from Korea. Lastly, in order to increase the government's responsibility, now the Special Adoption Act should be amended as soon as possible. We can get 100% agreement if it's not 100%. If most people agree, then the act should be amended as soon as possible so that the government will have bigger responsibility. So then solutions for inter-country adoption could be found, and inter-country adoption will decrease. I really believe that the act should be amended. And considering that children should be raised in a family environment, this might be off the tangent, but we really have to question whether we should keep care institutions or orphanages as it is. Korea is one of the 10th largest economies. It could be 10 years or 20 years from now. The government should set a target date for shutting down these care institutions. The government should consider this. When adoptive parents get together, we stay up all night to talk about how we can raise our kids better. And we find solutions through that process or get professional help. If policymakers reach out to these mothers, I believe that many good solutions will be found. Adoptive parents always say that adoption may not change the world, but can change a child's life. When we talk about today's theme, when we just think about children, I believe that whether in Korea or abroad, as long as they can grow up with good parents, anywhere will be best for them. I don't think anybody is in favor of intercountry adoption, but we have to make our nation that encourages domestic adoption. We have to be a nation where we can keep our own kids within the national boundaries. And that way, I believe that we can find solutions. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so now he's an adoptive parent who adopted 3 adoptees, and we heard his opinions on intercountry adoption. So, moratorium without an alternative, he's expressed his concerns. The government should take responsibility and find ways for us to keep our kids in Korea and send the children to Korean families. And it's not only adoption that's the problem at hand. So not even the adoption agencies, they are the problems. Okay, so we've listened to them all, and now we will gain the expert's view, Korean expert and an international expert. So first will be the international expert on intercountry adoption, Dr. Nigel Cantwell. So the global perspective on intercountry adoption. So he is going to make a presentation on this, and we will look at the video.
Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this important debate from a global perspective. I'm going to comment on where we are today in terms of intercountry adoption practice at the global level, then consider our experience of the outcomes of a suspension of intercountry adoptions, and then offer some thoughts on what the path forward for Korea might be. So on the global level, where are we today? The Hague Convention has been useful in confronting certain problems associated with intercountry adoption, and indeed in reducing unwarranted recourse to intercountry adoption. But it has by no means eliminated all those problems. This is demonstrated by the fact that expert groups at The Hague are still working on ways to prevent and address illegal adoptions and to tighten financial standards. The Hague Convention certainly constitutes a landmark in ongoing efforts to formalize, harmonize, and regulate more strictly the processes in intercountry adoption, including financial aspects, but it fails to tackle certain essential issues. This is because the Hague Convention is grounded in a system whose key features are the same as when the first adoptions took place from Korea in the 1950s, initially instigated by what were known as humanitarian concerns. Mediation by non-state actors, private entities or agencies, where prospective adopters pay for the privilege of caring for a child. That system is fundamentally flawed, but has not been seriously questioned until very recently. Adoption is now seen not as a humanitarian measure, but as a public child protection measure. And this pay-to-care system is not a children's rights approach to carrying it through. Indeed, no other child protection measure involving out-of-home care requires the carers to pay. Quite the contrary. Pay to care, in fact, reflects an adult-centered approach to intercountry adoption. It legally introduces vast amounts of money into a so-called protection process that consequently is at very high risk of being influenced or perverted by the financial interests involved. In other words, a long time ago already, Intercountry adoption became a demand-led practice to which states, agencies and individuals found it was often particularly convenient to sign up. For me, this is why we are, and indeed have been for some time, in the situation we find ourselves today, with adoption programs and cooperation agreements that are in no way based on the rights and best interests of the child. And this is why, in consequence, we have countries, including Korea, that find it all the more difficult to shake off the label of sending country or country of origin, a label assigned to them by receiving countries. This is not just semantics. It signifies the expectation that sending countries will keep on sending regardless. I want to mention at this point the tremendous impact that the voices of intercountry adoptees have had in recent years, by no means just in pursuit of efforts to trace their origins, but also in identifying and calling out illicit acts relating to their adoption, and thereby exposing huge weaknesses in the way intercountry adoptions are carried out to this very day. Thankfully, too, academics and activists have provided evidence to support their efforts to demonstrate the profoundly concerning nature of the ways in which adoption of children abroad has been and still is conceived and organized worldwide. As a result, an increasing number of countries are looking more closely at the nature and consequences of their participation in intercountry adoption. And many decide to impose a moratorium, in other words, to suspend intercountry adoptions while they do so. What are the outcomes of these moratoria? Well, imposing a moratorium invariably means a recognition that widespread, systematic and serious problems associated with intercountry adoption exist, and that they have not been or cannot be tackled effectively. Opponents of suspensions, often located in receiving countries, complain that suspensions prevent other children from benefiting from adoption abroad and thus run counter to the best interests of those other children. However, such arguments cannot be allowed to stand. The seriousness of the issues that generate suspensions mean that the risks for other children would of course be particularly high. At the same time, great care must be taken to ensure that all legitimate adoption cases pending at the time of the suspension are dealt with systematically and expeditiously. A significant proportion of countries have at some point suspended all intercountry adoptions of their children for a more or less lengthy period. Thus, between 1991 and 2009, no less than 11 of the 19 countries in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia were obliged to resort to a moratorium. And in 4 cases, they did so on 2 separate occasions. Many countries in Africa and elsewhere have followed suit, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. This shows the degree to which serious abuses in intercountry adoption have now been acknowledged worldwide. Temporary suspensions are often used to allow for the development and application of more effective safeguards for intercountry adoption. To date, such measures have simply involved improved adherence to Hague obligations, but have not tackled the system itself. Nonetheless, the result has invariably been a considerable reduction in the number of children subsequently adopted abroad, with domestic solutions being privileged and no discernible increase in the number of children in residential care. Indeed, in some instances, such as Guatemala, there has been a substantial fall in the number of children placed in so-called orphanages, precisely because the option of intercountry adoption does not presently exist, and that was the reason for their being placed in those so-called orphanages. In some cases, such as Romania, An initially temporary suspension was made permanent, except for citizens abroad, whereas certain other countries, such as Mali, have ordered permanent suspension from the start, though also with the exception of their diaspora. Significantly, both Romania and Mali were already contracting states to the Hague Convention when those decisions were made. Again, as with temporary suspensions, there is no evidence of negative ramifications in terms of children's rights. In fact, the reverse is true. Receiving countries, for their part, have tended to impose suspensions unilaterally on adoptions from specific countries that they consider unable or unwilling to respect the rights and best interests of children being proposed for inter-country adoption. In other words, each receiving country has determined, according to its own criteria, that the situation in a given country from where children are being adopted is unsatisfactory, and the receiving countries lay responsibility for this squarely on that same country. Last year, however, the Netherlands made the groundbreaking decision to suspend all inter-country adoptions. This is the first time that a receiving country under Hague procedures essentially asserts that the rights of actual or potential inter-country adoptees from anywhere cannot be securely protected under the system in place, and notably one that relies on private intermediaries and the pay-to-care principle, leading to adoption programs and cooperation agreements. Obviously, we don't yet know the consequences of the Dutch decision, but there is growing pressure on other receiving countries to undertake their own similar dispassionate analysis of inter-country adoption practice. So what might all this mean for the path that Korea would take? Well, of course, I make these suggestions with all due modesty as an outsider, but the first thing I would say is that you should no longer talk about Korea as being a sending country. You should no longer accept that others use that term. If you do that, it will set the scene for how Korea deals with the issue. Secondly, consider the specifics of the situation. In Korea, virtually all inter-country adoptions concern children of single mothers. This is very different from the realities of many other countries, and it offers for Korea clear opportunities for a range of initiatives to be taken that would enable those children to remain with their mothers and their families, or at the very least to remain in Korea itself. Never forget that the preamble of the Hague Convention states only that inter-country adoption may offer the advantage of a permanent family for a child, not that it does or must offer that advantage. Crucially, the Hague Convention does not oblige contracting states to carry out inter-country adoptions. It simply applies in every case if and when they choose to do so. Consequently, ratification of the Hague Convention is on the understanding that this provides a legal framework within which an adoption abroad will be undertaken, should it be deemed truly necessary on a case-by-case basis and not in the framework of programs and preset conditions. If a suspension of inter-country adoptions is ordered, then you should ensure that legitimate inter-country adoptions that are underway, what we know as pipeline cases, are dealt with appropriately and expeditiously. You should halt formal programs and agreements on inter-country adoption, and therefore halt the operations of all agencies. And even if the suspension itself is to be temporary, you should never restart those programs and agreements. In sum, while I would not say that never should a single child ever again be adopted abroad from anywhere, I would definitely say that no child should be adopted abroad under the system currently in place. And I'd like to end by mentioning what someone told me when I was in Andhra Pradesh in India in 2002, where I was investigating illegal adoptions already at that time from that state of India. And the activist, well-known activist, Geeta Ramaswamy, told me when I was there that intercountry adoption is a social experiment that has failed. Her words. And under present circumstances, I certainly think she was right. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kinter. What he said last really resonated with me. The last. In the pay-to-care system and under the current system, any children shouldn't be adopted abroad. And for sending countries, Africa and Eastern Europe, they have already declared moratorium. And even receiving countries, the Netherlands, declared moratorium. He is strongly opposed to intercountry adoption. Now, we will listen to the domestic expert on this issue. And Dr. Chaemin Kim carried out human rights violations investigation in intercountry adoption procedures. And he will tell us about human rights of adoptees and intercountry adoption. He is also here with us. Please give him a...
Okay, hello.
이제 해외 입양인의 인권과 해외 입양에 대해서 앞서 많은 분들께서 이야기해 주셨기 때문에 그 내용보다는 제가 뿌리의 집이 실시했던 해외 입양 절차 인권 침해 조사에 함께 참여하면서 그 조사에서 나왔던 내용을 중심으로 함께 이야기를 해보도록 하겠습니다. 사실 인권 문제로 접근을 하는 것이 입양과 관련해서 대단히 어려운 측면이 있는 것이 입양 기관이나 입양 부모 그리고 입양 아동 이 세 구도에 있어서 입양이 아동의 이익을 위해 실시하는 대안적인 방법이고 사회복지적인 차원에서 고려된 조치다라는 그런 의견들 인식이 강하기 때문에 인권 문제로 접근하기가 사실상 그리고 인권 침해가 있었다라고 밝혀내기가 대단히 어려운 사안 중에 하나라고 생각됩니다. 그리고 지금까지 있었던 해외 입양 같은 경우에도 그 해외 입양인들 스스로 이건 국가 폭력적인 현상이었다라고 말을 하고 있지만 그러면 이게 해외 입양이 정말 국가 폭력적인 성격을 띠고 있었는지를 규명하기는 실상 쉽지 않은 어떤 한계 지점도 분명히 있다라고 생각됩니다. 그렇기 때문에 이제 인권 문제로 접근하는 것이 더욱 중요한 사안이다라는 생각이 들고 그런 측면에서 과연 인권이라고 했을 때 우리 사회가 인권을 다 이제 당위적인 상식 수준으로 생각하고 있지만 각자가 처한 입장에 따라서 이 인권을
We all thought. Okay, sorry for this inconvenience. The speakerphone was off. So, well, actually, we have to approach the intercountry adoption from the human rights perspective. And in the issues regarding the intercountry adoption, so we have to talk about the dignity of human beings and like how human beings must live on. So I think the society itself must think seriously about this issue. So for more than 70 years in Korea, we have been involved in intercountry adoption. And so the issue should be who have been sent abroad for adoption. So after the Korean War, during the 1950s, we had war orphans and also biracial children and so for their safe nurturing being raised up in a family, the Korean government said that they are sending children for adoption overseas. So even if we take that into account, if we look at the reality, like as to why that actually took place, was that really a measure for the orphans? Well, we can't help but become skeptical about this. And the number of the war orphans, if we compare it to the period of orphans that were created during the industrialization period, we learned that orphans increased drastically during that industrialization period. And so in that case, we say, like if we look at this situation, we say the government has not fulfilled its full responsibility. And also, we think that it was a method for population management that the government exercised. So they would actually stipulate what would be considered as the normal family or normal population. So in other words, the government did not actively fulfill or implement its responsibilities and actually did not really take responsibility. And actually, the government itself, the country, was the main actor that violated human rights. So as a result, as many panelists also mentioned before today, so as we faced international criticism, we heard a lot of opinions and arguments that this problem must be solved. But on the other hand, some others say that if that actually takes place, for example, like children requiring protection, what would be the best option for them? The best option would be having them raised in a normal family. So we emphasize this principle, but since the 1950s and now, if we look at the flow of adoption in Korea, most of the children being sent abroad are children of single mothers. Then why are these children of single mothers not being recognized as a proper family? So this means that we're not only violating their rights, the children's rights, but also we are violating the human rights of the families as well. And this is being led by the government. So we cannot just say that the social perception is wrong. We don't have the measures to actually protect the children requiring protection, and the government must put in place the measures to protect these children first. That should be done first. And then, so I think first we have to let the birth families keep their children. And if that is not possible, like if there are still children that needs to be raised in some sort of a family, like receive family care, then we should think about another different measure. And so for that, we are sending children overseas. So since the 1970s, actually, back then, because of the politics in Korea, because North Korea and South Korea is divided, North Korea criticized South Korea. And so that is why we announced moratorium. That was in the late 1970s. And in 1996, we also announced a policy about that moratorium. But in reality, they were saying that inter-country adoption is inevitable. And although they talked about transforming into reverting to domestic adoption, they said that the social perception on adoption is not very favorable. So it is very difficult to promote domestic adoption. And that's why they said they have to send children overseas. So we have to think about how we're going to try and understand this sort of perception. And if we look at the investigation report, this investigation is what I was involved in, and regarding the criticism made regarding the human rights of violation regarding inter-country adoption, I think that the argument by the government is actually just an excuse, and through this report we asked back, shouldn't the government accept its failure to protect these children? And also the adoptees who were in the adoption agencies, they also said that is the case in reality. So so there has been a problem with the adoption procedure itself, that they only pursued efficiency and the adoptees did not have any rights to decide for their own lives. And so they had to go through the trauma that they were not being recognized as human beings and that their human rights have been violated. And so the report criticizes this as well. And regarding the adoption process and adoption records, the responsibilities of the adoption facilities, support for them, citizenship problem, so all of these things require the human rights investigation by the government. So if we ask the government, like, what have you been doing to solve this issue? The government is, well, I think the government was only quick to try to wrap it around using emotions, and so I don't think this was right. And actually, if we look at the poor situation that these adoptees were in, the government seems to ignore those things and only talk about the successful case stories. And so they keep on saying that it was the only way they could use to protect these children, and they try to justify their act. So how should we reshape the responsibilities of the government regarding these children? I think we have to ask the government's responsibility to take care of these sort of children. And so I would like to introduce the arguments that we made through this investigation report. So we asked for the government to actually establish a national body to investigate inter-country adoption. So that was the argument made by the international adoptees as well. And regarding the documents of international adoptees, they are scattered. And so we argued that the government should take care of the entire control and collect and manage the entire document. And we also argued for a moratorium. So in terms of moratorium, I'm sure there would be individual differences in terms of the opinions that they have, but we believe that it is more fit for Korea to actually stop inter-country adoption, and we said that the country should really actively pursue this goal. And actually, the government is pouring money to solve the low fertility rate issues in Korea. So they are actually using trillions of Korean won to solve the infertility rate, low birth rate. But actually, we're not seeing any visible results. And so I think the government should really reflect on this. And Korea is talking about normal family, which constitutes of mother, father, and a child. But now, actually, if we look at the reality of Korea, we have single household families in Korea. And also we have more diverse members in a family. So we shouldn't be emphasizing continuously on families constituting of 4 family members. So we think that our perceptions should also change, and I think the government should take responsibility. Well, it is long past time that they should have taken this responsibility, but now time is continuing to pass by, and this issue is always being procrastinated and then put behind the back burner. But regarding the inter-country adoption, I think it is time, well past time, that the Korean government should actively take responsibility. Thank you.
For the government tried to remove uncomfortable issues through inter-country adoption that led to violations of children, and also violated the rights of birth parents. And for international adoptees, they were not involved in decision-making process. So the investigation is needed, and better record management should be done, and moratorium should be declared. We heard from excellent panelists. Many people are joining us online through Zoom. 125 people registered, and we received questions, and we picked a few questions. And due to time limitations, we just pick a few questions. First of all, I would like to invite Ms. John and Ms. Engelstoff to answer these questions. As an adoptee and as a journalist, they have been investigating procedural issues and structural issues, and they talked a lot of these issues. And it seems that you tend to think negatively of inter-country adoption itself, and many people are asking this question. But there should be some positive aspects of inter-country adoption, because people are mostly familiar with successful stories. May I ask Ms. John to comment on the question? Thank you. As a journalist, I investigated this issue. It's one of the mostly frequently asked questions. As a journalist, I can talk about the laws and regulations and related issues. Am I against the issue itself? It's a very difficult question, because regardless of the intent of the person who asked this question, regarding regulations and because it really makes my issue with regulations totally meaningless. If I ask my friend, I have a problem with certain behavior, and the friend can be very angry and ask me, do you hate me? And I feel like the question is really like that. And I want to mention one thing. According to the Hague Convention, the interests of children should be promoted, and we have to think about the best way to promote this interest of children. And so inter-country adoption should be the last recourse. And I deeply agree with this basic principle. And without this, we believe that it's just a talk on the table.
질 거라고 이렇게 생각이 됩니다.
It's easy to understand.
Okay, may I ask Director Sonia Engelstoff to comment on the question?
다시 한번 또 얘기를 해주시면 어떨까요?
Yes, hello. I feel I have to speak. I have to elaborate on who I might be speaking for or who I'm representing. So I'm a 30 years old Korean adoptee with a Danish citizenship. And today I stand with other Korean adoptees, the ones who never had the possibility to travel to Korea, the ones who have never known another Korean person, the ones who will never be reunited with their Korean families, the ones who were never accepted and included by their adopters or their adoption country, the ones who were adopted multiple times, the ones who never were secured citizenship and therefore are in danger of being deported by the very foreign country that claimed them and promised to take care of them, the ones who felt that the only choice they had was to commit suicide, the ones who were killed in their adoption country. All the information that we cannot confirm about very basic things that a human life requires, as a name, a birth date. To me, international adoption means lifelong trauma and a constant fight to be an equal human being in my adoption country and my country of origin, Korea. You have to ask what is a lesser human being for a child to be adopted internationally? Thank you.
네, 당사자로서 하여튼간 여러 가지 이제 고민 그리고
As an adoptee, she saw many negative cases and she shared her experience with us. There are negative and positive experiences. We're not just talking about cases, but we also have to think about what is the best way to change our laws and regulations. We'll move on to the next question. Now, we have been talking about the negative sides of intercountry adoption, and President Lee will comment on the positive aspects. And he shared a moratorium without a good plan will be detrimental. So he mentioned a little bit. If intercountry adoption should continue, could you please tell us why? Historically, when we look at the statistics, about 250,000 Koreans were adopted abroad, and 170,000 were sent abroad, and 80,000 were sent domestically. It is hard to. It's really hard to figure out which case was successful and which case was not. And we don't have the statistics about that. But some issues make their ways to news. But we talked about negative cases, but there are also cases who are doing well, and these issues become are found in media coverage. But in most cases, we have to emphasize that children should be raised in family environment, and they should be loved, and they can grow up well with love. And it really depends on how people look at this. I am an adoptive father, and I have seen many cases who turned out really well. And one of them is Steve Morrison. He was adopted abroad when he was 13. And some older children were sent abroad, and they grew up really well. And there's also a gathering for adoptees in America. When you go there, we see many happy adoptive families. So really depends on. It's really more about which parents they are connected to, and of course, it would be best if they can grow up in domestic families. But if not, the second best option would be to find homes for them. From that perspective, it's my personal belief that all children should be raised in a home environment.
Okay, seems like nobody is for intercountry adoption. But if we ask why can't we stop intercountry adoption, mostly people say, oh, it is very difficult to do domestic adoption. And if we don't have any alternatives and stop intercountry adoption, won't the children be sent to the facilities? So people mostly talk about these things. So Professor Nigel Cantwell, so regarding the countries that announced moratorium, you told us that there is no evidence that the children's rights were violated. So if you could give us strong evidence, then the concerns that we have regarding moratorium, we think that would be a good answer to resolve their concerns. So Professor Nigel Cantwell, we'd ask you to comment.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that what we're trying to do is to remove the need or the perceived need for not just for intercountry adoption, but for alternative care in whatever form it might take. As was quite clear from the brief extract from the film by our dear Danish colleague, you're looking at mothers who do not want to give up their children. So it's not, the first question to ask is not how are we going to deal with the children of these mothers. It's how are we going to support these mothers, not just financially, but through the community, through better awareness, through a whole range of measures that are needed to enable those mothers to keep their children. In other words, to enable the children to remain with their mothers and perhaps their wider families. So, you know, this idea that suddenly if you stop intercountry adoptions, that all the children are going to go into some kind of institution or orphanage and have a terrible life is just the wrong way to approach it. If you want to stop being a sending country, and you should want to be stop being a sending country, then your first question is how can we prevent the perceived need for intercountry adoption, and indeed, as I say, you know, for any alternative care measure to be required, and that clearly is supporting the birth mothers. So in other countries, I mean, one of the biggest problems to come up in the 90s was the situation of Romania. And everybody said, you know, oh, if you stop intercountry adoptions from Romania, as Romania wanted to do in the end, then the institutions are going to be overflowing. It's going to be, and it just wasn't that at all. Romania found other ways. Little by little, it's particularly in Romania's case because it was in a difficult economic situation, which is not the case for Korea. But Romania was able to put in place a foster care system, was able to develop small group homes rather than big institutions, etc., was able to reduce the number of children in the big institutions. And it was the impetus of the decision to stop intercountry adoption that really motivated all sectors, government sector and private sector, to associations, etc., to move ahead in that direction. So that I can't go into detail about different countries' experiences, but I have never seen a country that stops inter-country adoption suddenly being overwhelmed by the number of children who need alternative care. And let me just say, if I may, just one quick point. Someone mentioned, rightly mentioned, that Korea is third in the table, if you like, of inter-country adoptions in recent years. And 10 years ago, it was sixth. And why is it third now? Well, one reason for the fact that it's third now is that two of the countries that were above it have stopped inter-country adoption. One is Guatemala, which is now has ratified the Hague Convention, and the other one is Ethiopia, which has not ratified the Hague Convention. But both of those countries were far higher than Korea was in terms of numbers, but have taken the decision to stop inter-country adoptions. That's I wanted to make that point. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you.
해외 사례를 볼 때 해외 입양 중단 선언을 한다고 해서 고아원이 넘쳐날 거라는 그런 우려는 안 해도 된다, 이런 말씀을 주셨고, 어떻게 보면은 지금 고아원, 그러니까 양육 시설의 문제가 아니고 친부모 그리고 원가정을 어떻게, 친생부모 원가정을 어떻게 보호할지를 좀 더 저희가 충실하게 이제 고민해야 될 것이 아니냐, 이런 말씀을 주셨는데, 뭐 저희가 중간중간 띄엄띄엄 들어가지고, 네, 그렇게. 그리고 제 표현 중에 뭐 긍정적, 부정적 이런 표현 때문에 좀 불편하신 분들이 계실 수 있을 것 같습니다. 근데 이게 제 표현이 아니고요, 우리 질문하신 분들의 표현이라는 점, 저희 인간이 이렇게 편향되어 있지 않다, 이렇게 생각을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다. 네, 마지막 또 질문을 드리겠습니다. 우리 김재민 박사님도 모라토리엄을 이제 주장하셨는데, 실제로 이제 이 과정을 조금 더 구체적으로 이제 설명을 해주시면 어떤 과정과 결과로 이제 기결될 거라고 생각하시는지를 조금 설명해 주시면 어떨까요?
Okay, so as for the moratorium, regarding since we made the report in the form of arguments, I have to tell you that it's not my personal opinion that created the report. But if I were to say my personal opinion, I believe that inter-country adoption must stop. It's not that I'm against adoption itself, but regarding inter-country adoption, I think ultimately in Korea, it should stop. That's what I think. Well, the social issues surrounding adoption itself, I don't think we have many of those venues. And so, whether you're against or for adoption, I think the government is trying to divide this conflict between the citizens. And so since the government is not fulfilling its responsibilities, that's why people are being divided, because everybody's saying the best benefits of children and that children should be raised within a family, and nobody is against this. But at the same time, raising within a family, well, regarding like what kind of family should the children be raised in? So the government should, well, even if you say that it's a family in difficult situations, like, can we say whether, I mean, in terms of the government responsibility, what will be its actual responsibility, whether whether it would be supporting supporting children to live with families that are also in difficult situations. So we have to think about this as well. And so if we talked about moratorium, just announcing moratorium is not enough. You have to have a detailed plan for this. Korea actually is aware of the problems of intercountry adoption, and it's already been there since 1970. So we make the announcement for moratorium, so policy-wise in 1970s. But for 30 or 40 years, policies or measures have not been put in place. And people were just saying, like, we are not in the right time or situation to really stop intercountry adoption. So I think the government must make a roadmap. It should have a body responsible for this to implement it.
네, 아동이익 최우선이라는 얘기는 누구든지 지금 하고 있다라고 생각이 되는데 그걸 어떻게 구현할지와 관련해서 의견이 갈리는 게 아닌가 이렇게 생각이 됩니다. 네, 시간 관계상 질의응답은 뭐 아쉽겠지만 이것으로 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 이 홀트 부부가 어떻게 보면 처음 이제 해외 입양 시작할 때 제가 보기엔 그 당시에는 우리는 해결할 역량도 의지도 없는 상태였다라고 이렇게 생각이 됩니다.
At that time, Korea didn't have the capacity when Holt Foundation was started adoption in Korea, but now we have different situations, and even though we are economically advanced, we are still sending kids abroad, and I hope that today's forum will contribute to changing the situation. And thank you everyone for participating. And thank you for everyone who have organized and all involved people and good neighbors save the children. And the task force, thank you so much for today. And now I will take this microphone to today's MC. Thank you. I'd like to thank Professor Chung for leading the forum, and thank you to all panelists and everyone for participating in today's event. Now we'll wrap up today's forum. Is the status quo of intercountry adoption acceptable? Thank you.